At the end of the Second World War, Korea, which had formerly been occupied by the Japanese, was divided along the 38th parallel. This was an internal border between North and South Korea, based on a circle of latitude. The Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, began on June 25, 1950, when some 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel. This invasion was the first military action of the Cold War. Welcome to History Bazaar. Today we're explaining the things you should know about the Korean War. But first, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If the best minds in the world had to set out to find us the worst possible location in the world to fight this damnable war, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson once said, the unanimous choice would have been Korea. The peninsula had landed in America's lap almost by accident. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Korea had been a part of the Japanese Empire, and after World War II, it fell to the Americans and the Soviets to decide what should be done with their enemies' imperial possessions. In August 1945, two young aides at the State Department divided the Korean peninsula in half along the 38th parallel. The Russians occupied the area north of the line, and the United States occupied the area to its south. By the end of the decade, two new states had formed on the peninsula. In the south, the anti-communist dictator Syngman Rhee enjoyed the reluctant support of the American government. In the north, the communist dictator Kim Il-sung enjoyed the slightly more enthusiastic support of the Soviets. Neither dictator was content to remain on his side of the 38th parallel, however, and border skirmishes were common. Both Kim and Rhee wanted to unify Korea under their rule, initiated border skirmishes that left thousands dead. Nearly 10,000 North and South American soldiers were killed in battle before the war even began. Even so, the North Korean invasion came as an alarming surprise to American officials. As far as they were concerned, this was not simply a border dispute between two unsustainable dictatorships on the other side of the globe. Instead, many feared it was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world. For this reason, non-intervention was not considered an option by many top decision makers. At first, the war was a defensive one to get the communists out of South Korea, and it went badly for the Allies. The North Korean army was well-disciplined, well-trained, and well-equipped. Rhee's forces in the South Korean army, by contrast, were frightened, confused, and seemed inclined to flee the battlefield at any provocation. Also, it was one of the hottest and driest summers on record, and desperately thirsty American soldiers were often forced to drink water from rice paddies that had been fertilized with human waste. As a result, dangerous intestinal diseases and other illnesses were a constant threat. On June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a full-scale invasion of the South after receiving the go-ahead from Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Until that point, the United States appeared disinclined to intervene. The year before, it had removed its last remaining troops from Korea, and that January, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson had given a speech in which he excluded Korea from America's defense perimeter. Nonetheless, the United States got involved in the Korean War almost immediately. On June 27th, as North Korean troops reached the outskirts of Seoul, the South Korean capital, U.S. President Harry S. Truman ordered naval and air forces into action. Then, 3 days later, he approved the use of ground troops. Though the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, it did not do so in this case. If a burglar breaks into your house, you can shoot him without going down to the police station and getting permission, Senator Tom Connally told Truman when asked if congressional approval was necessary. As a result, Congress has not formally declared war since World War II. On the first day of the war, the United Nations Security Council demanded that North Korea stop fighting and withdraw to the border along the 38th parallel. When this warning was ignored, it passed a second resolution, asking its members to assist South Korea in repelling the attack. It then established a unified command under U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, who had gained fame fighting in the Pacific during World War II. All of these measures would have been vetoed by the Soviet Union had it not been boycotting Security Council meetings at that time. In the end, although the United States and South Korea provided most of the manpower and military equipment, 15 countries fought with them, including the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Canada, Turkey, and Ethiopia. The invading North Korean troops were able to capture Seoul within 3 days, the first of 4 times that city would change hands, and quickly push their opponents back to the so-called Pusan perimeter in the extreme southeastern portion of the peninsula. The tide turned that September, however, in part due to a surprise amphibious landing that General MacArthur executed behind enemy lines at Incheon, the port for Seoul. UN troops then pushed deep into North Korea, precipitating rumors that they would be home by Christmas. When China entered the war in October on the side of North Korea, MacArthur initially discounted its importance. If they tried to advance, then there would be the greatest slaughter, MacArthur told Truman. He was quickly proven wrong, as a November attack by the Chinese sent the overextended American troops into the longest retreat in U.S. military history, nicknamed the Big Bug Out. They turned our army into a leadership horde, running headlong for Pusan, one soldier later wrote. This was something that President Truman and his advisors decidedly did not want. They were sure that such a war would lead to Soviet aggression in Europe, the deployment of atomic weapons, and millions of senseless deaths. To General MacArthur, however, anything short of this wider war represented appeasement, an unacceptable knuckling under to the communists. As President Truman looked for a way to prevent war with the Chinese, MacArthur did all he could to provoke it. Finally, in March 1951, he sent a letter to Joseph Martin, a House Republican leader, who shared MacArthur's support for declaring all-out war on China and who could be counted upon to leak the letter to the press. There is, MacArthur wrote, no substitute for victory against international communism. For Truman, this letter was the last straw. On April 11th, the president fired the general for insubordination. In July 1951, President Truman and his new military commanders started peace talks at Panmunjom. Still, the fighting continued along the 38th parallel as negotiations stalled. Both sides were willing to accept a ceasefire that maintained the 38th parallel boundary, but they could not agree on whether prisoners of war should be forcibly repatriated. Finally, after more than 2 years of negotiations, the adversaries signed an armistice on July 27, 1953. The agreement allowed the POWs to stay where they liked, drew a new boundary near the 38th parallel that gave South Korea an extra 1,500 miles of territory, and created a 2-mile-wide demilitarized zone that still exists today. The Korean War was relatively short, but exceptionally bloody. Nearly 5 million people died. More than half of these, about 10% of Korea's pre-war population, were civilians. Almost 40,000 Americans died in action in Korea, and more than 100,000 were wounded. Today they are remembered at the Korean War Veterans Memorial near the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., a series of 19 steel statues of servicemen, and the Korean War Memorial in Fullerton, California, the first on the West Coast, to include the names of more than 30,000 Americans who died in the war. We hope you enjoyed another episode of History Bazaar. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the fastest growing history channel on YouTube.